Russia's retreat from Kherson city has been deeply embarrassing for the Kremlin. It's not just that they've lost their only newly gained regional capital since February, but just a month ago, Putin was claiming that he wanted to annex the entire oblast, warning the Ukrainians that an attack on Kherson would be treated as an attack on Russia itself. So in this video, we're going to look at why the retreat from Kherson has been quite so damaging for both Putin and some of his ministers, and who, in the unlikely event of some kind of coup, could end up replacing them. To understand why the retreat from Kherson has been so politically damaging for Putin, you first need to understand why it's been bad news for the Russians strategically. Now, obviously, the retreat does make some strategic sense. As we mentioned in previous videos, the 20,000 or so Russian troops in the city have been basically cut off from the rest of the Russian army since the Ukrainians started shelling the Antonovsky Bridge and the Novokakova Dam, the two largest river crossings in the area. Not only that, but Russian positions in the city have been under extra pressure since the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, which took place in September. So, had they decided to stay in the city, Russian forces would have run the risk of encirclement. And this would have been particularly bad news for the Russians, because the 20,000 or so Russian troops in the area are some of their best. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate has claimed that the Russian troops deployed in Kherson include the elite airborne forces, known as the VDV, and Russian Special Ops. So, if Russia's elite units were decimated in Kherson, that would be terrible news, not just for Russia's military capacity, but also for the entire army's morale. It's also worth noting that a controlled retreat is obviously better than a chaotic one, like the one that Russian forces attempted in Kharkiv back in early September. That's because when Russian forces fled Kharkiv, including Izium, they suffered massive casualties and left copious amounts of military hardware available for the Ukrainians to collect and utilize on their way through. This time round, though, in Kherson, the Ukrainians will presumably be taking most of their equipment with them, and satellite imagery suggests that they've already set up defensive positions on the east bank of the Dnipro for them to fall back on once they've left the city. And these aren't any old positions. These look impressively well fortified and consist of 2 rows of trenches plus buried positions for vehicles. In fact, photos shared online seemingly imply that the Russians have built concrete bunkers along the coast of the Dnipro, where it's harder for them to set up ordinary trenches. But while a retreat does make some sense, insofar as it helps the Russians cut their losses, it is still a big loss, both symbolically and strategically. Symbolically, Kherson is the second largest city that the Russians have been able to capture, and the only regional capital to fall under Russian control since the war began in February. And as I mentioned at the start, it was only a month ago that Putin attempted to annex the entire oblast. It's also just yet another failure in a succession of losses. The Russians failed to take Kiev at the beginning of the conflict. They were run out of Kharkiv and have now retreated from Kherson. And strategically, if the Ukrainians are able to fully recapture Kherson, it provides them with a hub to reorganize and recalibrate their southern offensive, which allows them to put more pressure than ever on Crimea. That's because from Kherson, Russian HIMARS systems can target supply routes going via Armyansk into Crimea. And given that the Crimean bridge still hasn't been fully repaired, this means that Russian forces in Crimea will be almost entirely reliant on supplies running via Melitopol, putting them in a very precarious position. On top of that, 85% of Crimea's water supplies come via the Northern Crimean Canal, a waterway in Kherson city that directs water from the Dnipro into the peninsula. And presumably, this waterway will be cut off as soon as the Ukrainians arrive in Kherson. And while it won't make much of a difference to the state of affairs on the battlefield, it won't go down all too well with the Russians living in Crimea. You get the point then. The retreat from Kherson is a significant loss, and therefore a remarkable humiliation for the Kremlin and Putin personally. And while notable Russia hawks like Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin have nominally supported the state's decision, Prigozhin's proxies in the Wagner Group have started to criticize the Ministry of Defense for corruption, as well as lying about the Russian army's capabilities. And just the fact that well-known Russian hawks and Telegram accounts now feel confident insulting Russia's high command and Ministry of Defense does suggest that Putin's regime is really under significant political pressure. So, does that mean that we should expect the toppling of Putin sometime soon? Is the country losing faith in him? Well, to be honest, no, probably not. That's because thus far, most criticism has been directed towards the Russian army and Director of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, not Putin himself, with Putin still being the most popular politician in the country, at least according to official polling. However, while Putin might be safe for now, there is one scenario which is especially dangerous for him, and that's if the Russians lose the Crimean corridor. The Crimean corridor refers to the land bridge currently occupied by Russia, which connects Crimea to Donbass, and therefore Russia. In practice, this means the southern part of the Zaporizhia Oblast, including Melitopol and Berdyansk, as well as the southern part of the Kherson Oblast, at least until the Kherson Oblast connects with Crimea at Armyansk. Now, while the Russians currently occupy these territories, if the Ukrainians can successfully advance from Kherson to Armyansk, they'll cut Crimea off from the rest of Russia and its occupied territories, at which point Putin's regime will be at real risk of collapse. This is both because losing the land bridge and Crimea itself would be a humiliating defeat in and of itself, but also because once Crimea has been cut off from Russia via the land bridge, its eventual return to Ukraine becomes far more likely. That's because the damage to the Crimean bridge means that without a solid land connection, Russia will really struggle to resupply its forces on the peninsula. And once this happens, the Ukrainians should be able to gradually retake Crimea. Now, for the last month or so, the Russians have essentially kept the Ukrainians at bay by sending endless caliber missiles and drones at Ukrainian infrastructure. But the fact that the rate of strikes has slowed significantly suggests that the Russians are running out of missiles. And the West has already promised anti-air defense systems to help the Ukrainians against the ongoing attacks. Not only that, but Ukraine has even started developing its own kamikaze drone, similar to the Iranian-made drones that Russia have been relying on for a while now. Ukrainian weapons manufacturers have already said that they expect to have a new 200-kilogram drone capable of flying thousands of miles and carrying up to 75 kilograms of combat payload ready by the end of this year. On top of that, Russia's military capacity looks likely to decrease. Sanctions have hindered Russia's domestic manufacturing capacity, and Russia's military budget for 2023, released in September, will be about $80 billion, only about 35% higher than it was going to be pre-war. And this is despite the fact that the army has apparently recruited another 300,000 troops via its partial mobilization, representing about a 40% increase in total active personnel, which actually implies a decrease in spending per soldier and makes further mobilization increasingly unlikely. Now, interestingly, the Kremlin is increasing its domestic security budget by 45%, which suggests they're anticipating a lot more unrest over the next couple of years. And it looks like they're more focused on suppressing domestic unrest than actually fighting the war in Ukraine. All in all, while Putin might be safe for now, this is plausibly the most vulnerable he's been since the beginning of the invasion. And if Ukraine cuts off the Crimean corridor, then his position could become untenable. Ultimately, though, this is a developing story, and one that we're reporting on daily in the TLDR Daily Briefing. That's our daily rundown of the biggest stories from around the world, keeping you up to date with news from across the globe. You can watch the show by subscribing to the TLDR Daily YouTube channel, which is linked in the description, or you can listen along by searching in your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for your support.